The massive restaurant door swung open from the inside to the street. A grim man, looking like a storm cloud, burst out, dragging a young woman with him. Their somber faces revealed a thoroughly spoiled mood. "That's it. Never setting foot here again," he loudly protested. "This used to be one of the best restaurants, but now it's just a dive. The food is tasteless, the service is terrible, and that pole in the middle of the room. They've turned a respectable establishment into who knows what." The disgruntled man helped his companion into a luxurious premium class car, popped into the driver's seat, and hit the gas, vowing never to return. The restaurant's administrator, Morgan, a lanky brunette about 25 years old, looked perplexedly after the departing couple. In the past 2 months, they had lost all their regular customers. Since the new owner took the reins of the establishment into his crooked hands, everything had gone awry. The attempt to implement his own entirely new policies had resulted in the loss of their most valuable staff, including the experienced chef, the virtuoso Charles. Even the devastating effect of his unprofessional intervention didn't trouble the boss. The next set of rearrangements and changes followed. The nightlife enthusiast decided to turn the renowned upscale restaurant into a nightclub. After that, the place completely fell apart. The clientele changed drastically, revenue dropped, resulting in staff salary cuts, and everyone gradually dispersed to other restaurants. They were replaced by people of dubious appearance and reputation. Essentially, the only remnants of the former team were Morgan and the junior chef Richard, who now heroically carried the entire kitchen on his shoulders. The young man turned inside as he headed to the director's office. Something had to be done immediately. It couldn't continue like this. Carlos, a handsome young man almost the same age as the administrator, lounged in a leather chair, throwing his legs onto a desk piled with papers he had been struggling to understand for weeks. He plainly slacked off. Paper balls flew into the trash can. All these heaps of documentation, numbers, tables, and arcane terms bored him to death. A few months ago, suddenly becoming a widower, Carlos had hoped that his late wife's restaurant would help him improve his own finances, but the place only added problems and headaches. How did Carol manage this complex machinery before? Carlos had thought that the director's job only involved occasionally showing up at work, reminding employees with his imposing presence who the boss was. Collecting revenue proved to be not so simple. The restaurant business has its peculiarities and specifics. It's necessary to keep the workforce motivated, build relationships with suppliers, and stay updated on industry trends. A good restaurant cannot afford to drift with the current, or it will inevitably sink. Constant changes are needed. Menu, tableware, interior, entertainment program. The young owner found all of this boring and uninteresting. Only now did he realize what a burden his late wife had carried. Carlos tore himself away from his task, furrowed his brow, and stared at the ceiling, recalling the day when Carol had driven her car off a bridge and died. The body was never found, but the river had a very strong current at that spot, and the investigator had no doubt about the outcome of the horrific accident. Carol had no relatives left. Her father had died before their marriage, only having had the chance to bless the young couple. They had been married for just about a year and a half. Most of their married life had been marked by silent misunderstandings and arguments. In the last few months, their relationship had completely fallen apart. His wife was buried in work and had no interest in understanding the easygoing and free-spirited nature of her husband. He had hoped that Carol would support his desire to have fun and get the most out of life. No matter how he had begged her to quit everything and move abroad to a warm sea where they could spend their days lounging with a cocktail under a palm tree and not think about anything, Carol had firmly declared her intention to continue her late father's business. The bank accounts she inherited from him were meant to work for the future, not for wasting life in the present. Tired of suppressing his impulses and desires, first to please his calm father-in-law and then to avoid upsetting his wife, the young man no longer wanted to live by the rules of this family. Carlos sincerely didn't understand why they needed to work if there was already money coming in. When his wife brought up the idea that he should find something to do, he completely lost it. Clubs, parties, social gatherings, flashy girls, and wild dancing captivated him completely. One day, in the midst of the rivalry, Carol dragged him out of yet another club, pulling him away from a half-naked girl, put him in her car, and declared in a tone that broke no argument, "That's enough. I'm fed up. Tomorrow, I'm filing for divorce." Carlos, sprawled in the seat with a drunken, mocking smile, asked, "Well, go ahead then. How are we going to divide Dad's inheritance? Have you decided yet?" The young woman gave him a withering look and said calmly, "No, dear. You'll stay just as you are with an empty wallet. You deserve nothing by law or right. I want to live a wild life? Fine, but without my money." At that moment, Carlos realized for the first time that she was right. Without her, he would have nothing to live on. This realization made him sober up instantly, and he found words of repentance. With pleading eyes, he begged Carol to reconsider and not make any rash decisions. For a while, he stayed at home, pretended to have come to his senses, and even began consulting with his wife about future work. Carol looked at him with skepticism, but she no longer objected and gladly supported his desire to engage in something useful. Then tragedy struck. At the moment when the police informed Carlos of the terrible news over the phone, he was overwhelmed with conflicting emotions. Somewhere deep down, he felt a sense of relief. Now there was no one to pressure him or lecture him on how to live. From now on, he was his own master, and after inheriting the fortune, a wealthy widower, justifying his behavior as an attempt to recover from grief, Carlos returned to his old reckless lifestyle. This continued until he was caught by a girl who turned out to be the daughter of a high-ranking local official. At that point, Carlos became obsessed with the idea of marrying an even more advantageous match than the previous one. He went to great lengths to charm his new prospect and make a favorable impression on her future father, who had immense connections and almost unlimited opportunities. From now on, he could not afford any mistakes. Under the guise of a caring widower in need of warm family relationships, his strategy was successful, and his enterprise was rewarded when the young woman soon agreed to marry him. But as luck would have it, the well-oiled restaurant operation began to falter. Even the seemingly brilliant idea of turning it into a nightclub did not yield the expected results. It somehow turned out wrong. Money was needed more than ever, but there was little time left. The wedding was in a month and a half, and it would not do to arouse suspicion from the father-in-law. He had to maintain and uphold the image of a serious, trouble-free, and respectable fiancé. A timid knock came at the door. The administrator entered, his face showing dejection and despondency. "Carlos, I can't go on like this anymore. I'm quitting," came the voice from the threshold. The owner took his feet off the table and sat up properly, as a director should. He couldn't afford to let go of a worker who was willing to toil for a pittance. He certainly couldn't manage alone, and finding another like him would be difficult. "What's the matter, Morgan?" "What happened?" Carlos asked, feigning extreme concern. "Clients are leaving one after another," Morgan complained. "They don't like the new format of the place, and the kitchen is getting bad reviews. Only Richard is left all alone." Carlos was not eager to be pulled away from his dreams of a carefree future and deal with this mess, but the situation demanded it. Everything could fall apart completely. "So what needs to be done?" "Speak." The administrator scratched his head and hesitantly began. "We need to raise salaries." "No, that's not an option," the owner frowned. "We'll fix up the club first. Then I promise bonuses and raises to everyone. Well, at least a taster for the chef and assistant, because Richard is swamped and needs some help. He's an emotional, sensitive type. If things continue like this, we might have to switch to frozen convenience foods altogether," Morgan said. "Where am I supposed to find these workers now?" the director asked in a dissatisfied tone. He sighed heavily and pondered. No, the kitchen couldn't be ruined. He had boasted so much about his successful establishment to his future father-in-law that the latter had decided to celebrate the wedding there. Another brilliant idea popped into Carlos's head. "Let's go." He waved at the administrator and headed out of the office. Right outside, the director looked around. Unfortunately, there were hardly any passers-by. He approached a pair of young women walking by with determination. "Hello, would you be interested in working at a restaurant?" They looked at him silently and suspiciously before hurrying away, but Carlos was on a roll. Spotting a girl sitting alone on a bench wrapped in rags, he called out, "Hey, gorgeous, come over here." The administrator's eyes widened in horror, and he whispered, "Carlos, you're kidding, right?" But Carlos was already in his element. He loved pranks and spontaneous acts. Without giving it a second thought, he figured, here's a cook's assistant and taster in one, all for one salary. "Will you come work at the restaurant?" the director asked the approaching girl. A new plan instantly formed in his mind. He could rely on her and boost his standing with his fiancé and future father-in-law by helping someone in need. Amanda had a thing for charity. "I'll go," the drifter unexpectedly agreed. The administrator immediately groaned and rolled his eyes, clearly displeased. Inside, the beggar removed her torn old scarf and outerwear, revealing a young woman nearly their age with a short haircut and quite a tidy appearance. Her hands were surprisingly clean, and there was no unpleasant smell. But what stood out was her noticeably large belly. The young woman was clearly pregnant. The director burst into laughter. "Well, would you look at that? I wanted one worker, and look at this luck." The girl said nothing, only lowered her gaze. Richard, a tall, slightly overweight guy with glasses, sighed and looked over the newly hired employee. There was no choice but to get on with it. Perhaps she might be of some help. "Good afternoon. I'm Richard, and I'm the chef here," he introduced himself warmly. "Good afternoon. I'm Louise," the girl replied quietly, casting a sidelong glance at the towering chef. But they barely had a chance to get acquainted. "2 schnitzels and 2 salads," shouted the waiter from the doorway, announcing the customer's order. Richard immediately sprang into action, pulling ingredients from the refrigerator. His chaotic and clumsy movements confused him. He grabbed one thing, then another, dropped ingredients on the floor, retrieved new ones from the fridge, and ended up losing track of what he was doing. Louise watched his frantic activity in silence for a while, then neatly gathered her hair into a bun, washed her hands thoroughly, and began quickly chopping the ingredients for the dishes. Richard was initially going to protest her unauthorized interference in the cooking process, but soon realized that she was doing everything correctly, and her help significantly eased his workload. "Thanks," he muttered as he seared the meat. Despite the few patrons present, they clearly hadn't forgotten the establishment's prestige. Seeing the new girl, they exchanged glances and laughed. "Yeah, our director is up to his usual tricks again," the waitress joined in. "Where did you come from, sweetheart? Which dump did you crawl out of?" The new worker, lacking funds for new clothes, had plenty of pride. Ignoring the rude pair, she continued peeling vegetables amidst their barrage of stupid jokes. Not a single muscle on her face twitched. The two continued to mock her a bit longer, but seeing no reaction, lost interest, quieted down, and returned to the dining area. Richard looked at the assistant with pity, berating himself for not finding the right words or standing up for her. "Don't pay them any mind. They're like that with everyone." He tried to smooth things over. "They used to tease me too. They still call me a seal." Louise turned and smiled sweetly at him. "I'm not paying attention," she replied calmly. "But why do you let them call you that? You're the head chef. After all, head chef, my foot," the young man exclaimed with frustration. His chubby cheeks flushed with embarrassment, making him look like a giant bun. "Everything always falls apart. I'm such a klutz," he scolded himself. "At home, I can make such masterpieces. I could even apply for a Michelin star. But at work, it's like a vicious cycle. Everything turns out awkward and bland," Richard confessed. For the first time in many years, he was able to vent his frustrations. For some reason, this unfamiliar girl inspired a sense of trust in him, and he immediately felt lighter. Such a sincere tirade touched Louise. She wanted to comfort this insecure guy and help him, at least with some advice. "You're just nervous and not organizing your process correctly," she explained. "Just relax and understand that you are the creator here. Whether the client returns to this place depends on you." The girl smiled at the guy, who was listening with his mouth slightly open. Suddenly, she walked to the door leading to the dining area and beckoned him over. "Look," she said, pointing to a couple seated by the window. "This guy and girl are the ones you're preparing for right now." He's holding his companion's hand and saying something to her. "I have a feeling it's about love, right?" "Sweethearts," Richard glanced back at her and nodded. "These are your guests. They could have gone to the burger joint just around the corner or stayed in at home and ordered pizza, but they came to your place. Richard, do you want to give them a gastronomic delight and a mood that will make them remember this evening?" The guy looked at the couple waiting for their order with astonishment. For the first time, he viewed his work from this perspective. Louise nodded toward the ready dish waiting to be served and suggested, "Richard, imagine you're an artist creating a brilliant painting, and I'll be handing you the brushes and mixing the paints." Understanding her hint, the chef suddenly transformed. The stiffness and constant tension disappeared, and his eyes sparkled with creative inspiration. With quick, precise movements, he assembled incredibly appetizing salads and beautifully garnished plates of meat. Time and space ceased to exist for him. Louise couldn't help but admire the inspired chef. Richard ran to the dining area twice more to see his guests' reactions to the dishes he had poured his soul into, and each time he returned to his station, satisfied and happy. Now he wasn't afraid of new orders, and the fear of messing up and ruining everything vanished without a trace. The guy was overwhelmed with an irresistible desire to create and share his creative energy with people. All evening, the satisfied waiters, who had received generous tips, looked at the chef with respect and passed on the client's words of thanks. From that day on, Richard no longer dragged his cross. Burdensome family obligations faded. On the wings of inspiration, he flew to work, where at the entrance, with an unchanged gentle smile, he was greeted by the fragile girl with a huge heart. The newcomer, with her balanced and accommodating nature, seamlessly and effortlessly blended into the team. Her arrival unexpectedly influenced the entire atmosphere of the establishment. A strong friendship developed between Richard and Louise. One day, Richard decided to share with the girl a sad story from his childhood that had left a mark on his character. "When I was 11 years old, my father left me and went to another family, where he soon had a son." The impressionable Richard convinced himself that he wasn't good enough, since his father chose another child. "I lived with this belief for several years, which it seemed led to my insecurity and low self-esteem. I don't remember my father at all. I lived with my mom alone all my life," Louise suddenly confessed, her eyes hiding a quiet sadness. The young man nervously bit his lower lip and decided to ask a question that had been troubling him for a long time. "How did you end up on the street?" Louise flinched and looked away. Then she realized, "Oh, I got carried away. I still have a bunch of things to do." Understanding that the girl was intentionally avoiding the answer, Richard didn't press further. It was probably a very painful topic, just like her pregnancy. He decided that if she wanted to, she would tell him herself. The appearance of this mysterious assistant in the kitchen had an amazing impact on the young chef. The newfound inner harmony and confidence in his abilities were conveyed to the surrounding world. Now both the staff and the clients perceived Richard differently, with greater respect and warmth. The guy knew who to thank for such radical changes in his life. Glancing furtively at the calm, focused profile of the assistant, he often found himself admiring her, almost mesmerized. The worn, faded clothes of the young woman did not embarrass him. Her presence somehow especially moved him. Even her pregnant belly did not detract from her beauty. She was as lovely as a Madonna. More and more often, their silent, meaningful glances crossed paths, and an exhilarating spring-like mood lingered in the air. Only Carlos was not pleased with the positive changes in the restaurant. This strange young woman, whom he himself had hired, now caused him wild irritation. Today, the director cast a discontented glance at the former homeless woman, who was peacefully chopping herbs. "What are you doing there for?" he snapped at her. "The floor by the sink is wet. Wipe it up or you'll come back and I'll have to answer for you," he grumbled. The girl immediately took a cloth and wiped the water droplets. This silent obedience only further irritated the young director. It was as if she deliberately kept getting in his way. Carlos couldn't help but needle her as he passed by. The gesture of hiring the beggar had not had the intended effect. Only kind Amanda had genuinely admired his noble act, so it would be unwise to get rid of the irritant now. He simply didn't like Louise, though he couldn't explain this sudden dislike. There was one reason: this pregnant beggar somehow subtly reminded him of his deceased wife. Perhaps it was in her gaze or her movements. He even caught himself intentionally tormenting and humiliating the newcomer. Rather, it was not her, but Louise in her face, seeking revenge for the time when he was with his wife and lived by her rules. Yes, Louise was certainly handling her duties well, and now the chefs were being praised, and the clients were satisfied. But the resemblance evoked by memory unsettled and irritated him. But it was okay, he just needed to get through the wedding and get rid of this burden, along with all the fairies, Richard and Louise. Sell the restaurant and forget it like a bad dream. No, he was waiting for something else, a better life. Thoughts about the opportunities opening up after the wedding made Carlos smile. His future father-in-law had secretly confessed that he was preparing a surprise for the newlyweds, a grand honeymoon abroad. There, the legitimate husband would handle Amanda, convincing her of what he hadn't managed with Carol. The new lover was different, with a soft, pliable character. Mold her as you wish. They would live abroad, and her father would do everything for his beloved daughter. Finally, his dream would come true. Louise left the kitchen and walked into the hallway, noticing again the strange man with cold, fish-like eyes and a sports bag in his hand. His lifeless gaze made her shiver. He visited the director about twice a week, but no one knew who he was. "I have no idea," Richard answered indifferently to her questions. "Maybe it's about the wedding. It's not our business." Louise disagreed with him. It was unlikely that someone with such a frightening appearance was involved in organizing the celebration. Something didn't seem right. And so the wedding day arrived. Carlos spared no expense. He hired a designer for the venue's decor, 3 more chefs for the evening, and spent the last of his money on a host, live music, and a huge cake. The flowers and decorations were perfect. The bride, looking happy, was leaning against the groom. The father-in-law, holding a glass, was giving the third toast, looking kindly at the newlyweds. The guests were lively, enjoying the creation of another social unit and the chance to eat and drink well. At the moment when the talkative host finally announced a short break, Louise unexpectedly appeared in the hall. Everyone was busy socializing, and no one paid her any attention. She did not go on stage or take the microphone. "Dear guests, I have an announcement," the young woman proclaimed calmly. Carlos was stunned by such audacity. He turned red and angrily said, "What are you doing here? You should be in the kitchen. Get back to your place." "Let her speak," Amanda stopped him. "Maybe she has a congratulatory message from the team. Let her speak." The father-in-law took over. Carlos bit his lip. Going into conflict on such a day was unnecessary, and the girl continued from the stage. "Thank you. You are wonderful people. I'm truly sorry that you've decided to tie your fate to a scoundrel like Carlos, who destroyed his wife's business and now deals in some forbidden substances in packets." The groom jumped up, fearfully glancing at his father-in-law. "What are you babbling about, you fool?" Ignoring his rudeness, Louise continued. "And also, Carlos, I'd like to send you greetings from the other side," she said, pointing to a female figure that had just emerged from the darkness as if from nowhere. The petrified Carlos, as if enchanted, watched her approach until she stepped into the light. "Well, hello, Carlos." It was Carol, alive and well. She stood in the middle of the hall, just as he had last seen her, as if she hadn't disappeared for several years. The young man's legs gave way, and he heavily sank into a chair. "But how is this possible?" All the guests froze, not understanding what was happening. The bride was also stunned and could not utter a word. The collective silence was pierced by the groom's unusually hoarse and creaky voice. You were the only one," he said. "I fell asleep after intentionally tampering with the brakes on the car," Carol replied. "That still needs to be proven," came the muffled reply. "Of course," Carol said calmly, looking around the hall. At that moment, plain-clothed police officers entered and restrained the groom. The guests snapped out of their daze, and their anxious murmurs filled the room. A frightened woman cried out, and the bride and her father rushed to them, trying to make sense of the situation. "What's going on here? Can someone explain?" the high-ranking father-in-law shouted nervously, throwing his hands up in confusion. Then a detective entered at a slow pace and handed Carlos a warrant for arrest and search. "You are charged with attempted murder and possession and distribution of illegal drugs in especially large quantities." Carol simply stood by, detachedly observing everything, not understanding how she had reached this point and recalling how it all began. As far back as she could remember, she and her father had lived together. Her father was an interesting, prominent man and also wealthy. Women would fawn over him, and he occasionally had brief affairs, but he never brought anyone home officially. He never introduced anyone to his daughter. He lived by his own principles and rules and did not tolerate anyone contradicting him. She had long known that he was willing to do anything for his daughter. Carol attended the best school, was an honor student, and an active participant. From first grade, she shared a desk with a shy boy named Archie, who carried her briefcase and cast admiring glances at her until graduation. Though he never confessed his feelings, Carol grew accustomed to thinking of her classmate as a loyal friend. It never occurred to her what strong emotions were brewing in his heart. Only after graduation, while seeing Carol off to the foreign university her father had sent her to, studying modern economics, did Archie awkwardly and stumblingly confess his love. Carol was a bit surprised, smiled, and hugged me, making her feelings clear. Both felt awkward, and from then on, they hardly spoke. Studying abroad was easy for Carol, but nostalgia for her home never left her. She missed her father terribly and was ready to leave at any moment. It was then that she and her father had their first and last serious argument. When Carol decided to return home after finishing her studies against her father's wishes, she could no longer stay there. She disliked the air, the people, and everything seemed alien and strange. Her father had dreamed that she would stay in a country with a developed economy, believing it was for the best, but Carol didn't want her fate decided for her. She came back, placed her international diploma on her father's desk, and firmly stated that she wanted to live here, near him. After such a mature and clear declaration of intentions, the man's heart melted. He was completely at ease when his daughter agreed to inherit his pride and joy, the best restaurant in town. It was during this time, as it turned out by pure chance, that Carol met Carlos, a tall, light-haired guy who dazzled with his manners and tried to charm her in every way. He never left her side. Now she realized that she had never really known Carlos, neither before nor after the wedding. He was like a chameleon, a cunning guy who could change his colors to suit his desire to please. At the time, she was amazed at how much they had in common interests: music, books, movies. Such coincidences just didn't happen. She thought this meeting was not random. Carlos was the one she needed for her entire life. By that time, her father was very ill and expressed his desire to find a suitable match for his daughter, so he would no longer have to worry about her future. Carlos managed to persuade him, agreeing to the marriage. The man seemed to relax immediately, stopping his fight for life. His soul soon faded away. With her father's death, Carol's world turned upside down. She had grown so accustomed to him being always around. She could visit or call at any time, share her joy, or on the contrary, cry just to hear his loving, familiar voice. Her father always had time for talks with his daughter. After waiting a few months, the groom began urging Carol to formalize their relationship, saying it was her father's last wish. The girl agreed, and they quietly got married without any festivities or fanfare. Carol threw herself into work, wanting to honor her beloved father's memory by making his cherished creation, which he had poured his soul into, even better. She even contemplated opening 2 more restaurants like his. In her dreams, she always saw her husband as a reliable support. She had asked him several times to get involved in the family business, but after the wedding, Carlos seemed like a completely different person. Now he lived extravagantly, spending his wife's money recklessly and squeezing every bit out of life. Hearing from acquaintances that her husband was indulging in affairs on the side, Carol initially felt distressed, but then simply became angry with herself for misjudging him. When she caught her husband drunk and partying with some women, she told him exactly what she thought. The world completely fell apart. On the day Carol set off in her car to visit a new supplier outside the city, the memories of that ill-fated accident sent shivers down her spine. She only remembered the brake pedal failing as she turned onto the bridge and felt it suddenly give way into emptiness. Carol lost control, and the car sped down a steep slope towards the river. Time seemed to slow down. The girl watched in horror as the edge of the cliff approached smoothly and inexorably. The clawing grip of fear tightened around her heart and paralyzed her body, leaving her unable to even move. Well, this as it flashed through her mind. A strong jolt to her chest and head followed, with the steering wheel knocking her out for a moment, separating her from the sharp penetrating pain. She woke up in the river. The cabin quickly filled with water. Pulling on the door, she managed to open it just in time. She escaped from the car, which promptly sank to the bottom. The current swept her away and spun her around. Panic and the fear of following the car into the dark abyss drove her to fight with all her strength. She struggled to stay afloat, paddling, but beyond that, her mind was a complete fog. It was unclear how long she floated downstream. She only came to when someone vigorously shook her, bringing her back to consciousness. An intense pain engulfed her body. She was wet and cold. Carol moaned, her voice emerging as a weak, hoarse sound. Opening her eyes, she saw the face of a young woman who seemed familiar. Looking around, she realized she was lying on the riverbank in wet, muddy clothes. The stranger leaned over her anxiously, peering into her eyes. "It's awful," Carol whispered with uncooperative lips. She was indeed experiencing excruciating headaches and felt like her chest was broken. On top of that, she was shivering from the cold and felt unbearably cold. "I'm Louise, and you," the girl introduced herself. Carol weakly answered and unexpectedly asked if they had met before. Louise shrugged uncertainly and asked what had happened to her. "Please, just go," Carol replied, but seeing that the rescued girl was shivering, Louise ran off to get help. Within a couple of minutes, she returned with a neighbor, a burly man with stubble on his broad face, who picked Carol up as if she were a feather and carried her straight to a small house nearby. Louise removed her wet clothes, laid her on an old metal bed with a huge fluffy comforter, and covered her with 2 down blankets. Carol, through her half-closed eyelids, watched her rescuer and couldn't quite remember where she had seen her before. At the same time, Louise was having the same thought. The strange feeling of déjà vu had gripped her from the first glance at the pale face of the unfortunate girl and hadn't let go until now. Passing by a large mirror hanging on the wall, she suddenly stopped and looked at her reflection. Suddenly, enlightenment struck her. Of course, that's where this inexplicable feeling comes from. This Carol looks strangely like me, like Louise. Once in bed, the rescued woman felt as if she had vanished into a warm, dense cloud, lovingly wrapped in soft, fluffy edges. It was warm and cozy. The pain made her eyes close on their own, drawing her into a heavy, restless sleep where she was endlessly falling, drowning, falling, and drifting. Is she going to die? "Maybe we should call a doctor after all," a worried, familiar voice asked. "Well, you should have called," another voice said, disgruntled. "Why did you call then? Sorry. I didn't mean to offend. I'm worried. She's very pale. Look at her, she's feverish. It's been 2 hours already." Carol struggled to open her eyes and noticed that it was already late evening outside. The woman turned out to be small and thin, with a clean, neat handkerchief, as if she had just come from evening service at the church. She was probably a local healer. Carol didn't trust alternative medicine much, but she liked this old woman. She emanated an inexplicable, intoxicating aroma, something between the smell of incense and a bouquet of wildflowers. With her wrinkled, narrow palms, she moved her hands over Carol's body, then made her chest and head disappear, causing a sharp pain. Then, matter-of-factly, she said, "Well, it's clear here. A severe bruise in the chest and head. A fracture, it seems. No, in the evening I'll give you some herbs. Keep in mind that you'll need to brew and drink them and apply these compresses. Don't worry, it will pass quickly." The healer fell silent, then frowned and said thoughtfully, "There's something else." She looked at Louise and firmly commanded, "Come here. Give me your hand." The girl extended her hand in surprise. The old woman grasped it and held it for about a minute. Carol opened her mouth to call out to the healer, but something stopped her. Softly snoring, she had apparently fallen asleep. Louise widened her eyes significantly and put her finger to her lips, indicating quiet. "Don't disturb," she said. The old woman finally emerged from her trance and joined the girl's hands together. "Do you know that you are sisters?" she suddenly and simply asked. The girls stared at each other in shock. "What? How is that possible?" Carol burst out. The old woman shrugged. "I can see that you are sisters. In fact, identical twins separated at a young age." Then she added, "I never make mistakes. They show me a picture from there," asked a stunned Carol. "From there," the healer cautiously repeated, pointing her thin finger upwards. Everyone fell silent, processing the information. Then Carol shook her head confidently and said firmly, "No, you just saw that we look alike. No, my father would have told me. It can't be." Maybe Louise suddenly spoke up, who had been holding her breath while watching the rescued girl. Everyone stared at her, waiting for an explanation, but she looked noticeably nervous and hesitated. Then, finally gathering her thoughts, she told everything she knew. Louise and her mother had lived in that small house their whole lives. As she grew up, the daughter began asking questions about her father, but her mother only scowled and repeated the same thing. Her father had left her and gone away. Her mother worked as a teacher at the school and earned a reputation as a strict disciplinarian. She was equally stern with her students and with Louise. She gave no leniency to anyone. The students didn't even hide their dislike for the overly principled teacher. The girl was hurt by all the epithets she was given. Nonetheless, she loved her mother and knew for sure that her mother loved her too. She just never was affectionate. When the girl graduated from school with a gold medal, she followed in her mother's footsteps to the Pedagogical Institute. However, due to her naturally softer temperament, she developed a completely different approach to children, for which she was often reprimanded by her more experienced mother. Despite her mother's arguments, Louise stubbornly continued with her own methods, believing her approach to be more effective. Unfortunately, her excessive straightforwardness and professional deformation did her mother a disservice. One day, her mother had gone to the city and missed the train, having to wait for the last one, nearly at night. Witnesses said that the woman began making sharp remarks to a drunken group at the station. They quickly beat her up and then ran away. Louise remembers well how she arrived at the hospital and went into her mother's ward. At first, she couldn't recognize her, and then she cried for a long time by her bedside. Her mother's face was a solid maroon blue. Her right arm and leg were broken. But most importantly, the scoundrels had managed to break her spirit. They crushed her belief in the good and bright, in truth and humanity. The woman simply no longer wanted to live and felt that her time was short. Before she died, she told Louise about her father. Her parents had met when they were very young and fell in love at first sight. It was like an electric shock, as if even sparks were involved. The sudden marriage surprised those around them, who couldn't understand how two people with such stubborn natures and explosive temperaments could decide to tie their fates together. Two representatives of the element of fire tried to live together, and for a time they actually succeeded. When the twins were born, the young father began to seriously contemplate the future. He had grand plans, but he saw no prospects in their small village. Unfortunately, he was unable to persuade his wife to try their luck in the big city. She decided to stay and work at the local school. No amount of arguments, pleas, or ultimatums could change her mind. Over time, the young couple completely stopped understanding each other. Each insisted on their own way. They argued more and more frequently, and then they would deliberately ignore each other for several days. A real scandal erupted when the 2-year-old girls accidentally spilled ink all over a drawer of documents in the writing desk. When the parents saw that all passports, birth certificates, and notarial papers were irreparably ruined, they were horrified, but they reacted differently. The mother, in a fit of anger, wanted to punish the daughters, but the father categorically opposed it, trying to prove that they were still too young to understand what they were doing. The woman stubbornly insisted, half angrily shouting that she was a trained teacher and knew how to raise children herself, and that she could manage without him in this matter. The conflict escalated like an avalanche, and mutual accusations from both sides burst out like lava from a volcano. The husband was told directly to his face, "My children don't need such a father. What can you teach them? You're a failure." The man could not tolerate such words. "Fine," he shouted. "If that's the case, I'm taking one daughter and leaving. We'll see who raises them better." "Oh, is that so? Then get out. Do you think I'll cry over you? We'll do just fine without you," the mother screamed in a fit. By an unspoken agreement, the father took Carol, who clearly preferred him, loved spending time with him, and sitting on his lap. Louise clung more to her mother and thus stayed with her. Thus, the foolish stubbornness of the unstable and obstinate parents tore apart the sisters. Louise couldn't believe what she had heard from her mother, but she also couldn't interrogate Carol in such a heavy state. For the first time in her life, the daughter saw tears in the eyes of the Iron Lady. Soon after, her mother passed away, and the sorrow tore her heart apart. But the thought of her father and sister wouldn't let her rest. Louise even tried to find them, but after the divorce, her mother kept her maiden name for herself and her daughter, and she never had the chance to provide her with her father's details. Carol listened, holding her breath, never taking her eyes off her sister. Her soul unexpectedly opened its door and led in the missing piece, which immediately fitted into the empty spot in her inner world. Enlightenment finally came. It was this lifelong feeling of something missing, something long lost, something with which there was still an unclear invisible connection, another kindred soul. This incredible story simply didn't fit in her head. How much trouble had their parents caused in their youth? But for what? To prove something to each other? And what did they ultimately prove? These heavy thoughts completely drained the girl, and closing her eyes in exhaustion, she lay back on the pillow. What concerned her now was something else. Carol had no doubt that the accident was staged by her husband. It was no coincidence that he had announced the day before that he had put his car in for service and had taken her car to go somewhere. He had been so tense all evening after returning. But what next? How could she prove that this was his doing? Returning home meant putting herself in danger. Troubling thoughts consumed her mind completely. The girl didn't even realize when she fell asleep. Something heavy, yet very warm and soft, was warming Carol's chest in her sleep. She reached out to free herself from the weight, only to encounter a large, furry, living creature. It startled her, and Carol opened her eyes. Right in front of her face, she saw the huge, shining eyes of a cat that had settled on her chest. "What are you afraid of?" "It's just me," Louise's voice was heard. "Tiffany, leave Carol alone. Go eat something instead." The cat stretched slowly and, with a sense of dignity, made her way to the kitchen, rubbing against Carol's side in farewell. Louise entered the room with a smile, wiping her hands with a towel. "How are you? Sorry about the chill. I didn't notice, but it's actually good that she lay on you. They say cats have healing powers." Carol nodded. The headache and chest pain really were lessening. Maybe it was the effect of the herbal infusion from Gwendol, which she had drunk before sleep, or maybe it was thanks to her new friend Tiffany. In any case, the rescued woman managed, with some effort, to get out of bed on her own. Louise, carefully supporting her, took her to the bathroom and then settled her into a comfortable chair in the kitchen that her mother used to love. She used to sit in it late into the night, checking students' notebooks. The hostess had already managed to fry pancakes and make tea. In the morning, sitting across from each other, the girls had breakfast. Not knowing how to start a conversation, they hadn't managed to talk the day before, and today an awkward silence hung in the air. The cat approached and began to gently rub her fiery fur against each girl, as if urging them to start talking. They laughed, and then looking at each other and realizing they were thinking the same thing, they burst into genuine laughter. The tension in the room dissipated in an instant, thanks to Tiffany's intervention. "Tiffany recognized you," Louise said softly, looking Carol straight in the eyes. "She usually hides from strangers, so you're one of us," she smiled and added, "I'm glad I have a sister now." They looked at each other's faces with curiosity, enjoying how much they had in common. The new sense of accessibility, kindred spirit, and inspiration was always reassuring. Carol, in turn, told about her life and shared her suspicions about her careless husband's intentions. Louise frowned, looking saddened. "What a scoundrel," she thought, and asked her sister, "What should we do? Is there any way to follow him?" Carol sighed. "Who would do it? He would recognize me right away." "How about I do it?" Louise suggested with bright eyes, noticing Carol's skeptical look. "Well, the school is on break. I'm as free as the wind. I'll cut up the Christmas pageant costume and pretend to be a beggar. I could even stuff a pillow under my clothes to look pregnant for more authenticity." Carol was reluctant to agree to such a scheme, fearing for her sister's safety. Time passed, and without any other plan, Louise finally managed to convince her. After about 3 weeks, the mission went fairly well. The newly minted beggar was able to gather some information about the widowed heir of the restaurant. After that, they devised a plan. Louise would discreetly keep an eye on the restaurant in the guise of a vagrant. However, thanks to Carlos, she unexpectedly got the chance to observe Carol's husband from the inside. Returning late one evening from her new job, Louise joyfully recounted all the details of her day, but Carol responded to the news differently. "You're not going there anymore," she declared. "Why?" "Everything seems to be going well." Her sister was taken aback. "You don't understand. I now have no idea what that man is thinking or what he's capable of," Carol said. "I don't want anything to happen to you." A tear suddenly sparkled in her eye. Louise quickly reassured her. "You're my dear. Everything will be all right. Most importantly, we're together now." Embracing each other, the girls continued to sit and discuss their next steps. Then, Carol suddenly remembered her school crush, Archie. Someone from her former classmates had mentioned that he now worked as a detective in the police. It all came together. He could really help. But all previous contacts were lost with the phone that had sunk in the river. In this modern age, no one trains their memory or remembers phone numbers by heart. Carol felt powerless. Plus, she couldn't afford to appear in the city. But her sister surprisingly managed to locate the young detective Archie quickly to pass along greetings from a former classmate. From his expression, it was impossible to tell whether he was happy to hear from his first love or not. But judging by the fact that he rushed to the small town from many kilometers away that same evening, he clearly cared. "Archie, is that you?" the girl cried out, barely recognizing the grown, disheveled man, the same hesitant, skinny admirer who used to walk her home from school. "Aye," Archie said with a shy smile, approaching closer and taking Carol's hand. Looking into her deep eyes, he thought they had become even more astonishing and alluring. His old love had sunk into the depths of his sensitive soul, but even in his youth, it had awakened, stretched its wings, and flown free. Unlike Carol, he had kept track of his former classmate, knowing about her impending marriage right after her return. After hearing about her death, he had been plagued by depression for several months, until Louisa appeared at the precinct as an emissary. Archie and Carol talked until late into the night. They initially discussed the accident and the operation for the girl's future revival, and then fondly reminisced about their carefree youth. Now the admiring gaze and warm, caring hand of her school admirer, gently holding her hand, were perceived by Carol in a new light. The extraordinary energy radiating from him enveloped her in a blanket of serenity and calm. How foolish she had been, searching for true love far away, relying on appearances and Carlos's silver tongue, when a genuine, loving man had always been unobtrusively near, ready to help her at any moment. Archie examined Carol's car, which had been found with difficulty 200 meters from the crash site. The suspicions were fully confirmed. The brake cylinder had been deliberately damaged, leading to the brake system failure and the accident. As Louisa played the role of a spy, she quickly figured out that things were not so simple. At the new club, the observant girl, whom no one paid attention to anymore, discovered that Carlos, trying to fill his pockets, had gotten involved with drug trafficking and was dealing in substances. She even managed to find out the delivery schedules. The dealer turned out to be that suspicious stranger. The last shipment had been on the eve of the wedding. Archie had to risk his badge to make an arrest at the high-ranking official's wedding, but everything went according to plan. After discovering a large stash of packaged drugs in the director's office, he now faced a long prison sentence. Such is the outcome when one resorts to the most monstrous means in pursuit of a carefree life. The sisters couldn't contain themselves and rushed into each other's arms. They laughed through their tears on the street and embraced. They hadn't seen each other for several months, only keeping in touch by phone. During this time, Carol and Archie had gone on vacation, coinciding with their honeymoon, and then Louisa had left for another city, where she was invited to participate in a television cooking show. Work matters constantly distracted both sisters, and they never found the time to meet. They missed each other so much that they decided to live next door and solemnly promised never to part again. While hugging her sister, Carol suddenly pointed to Louisa's small belly visible beneath her open coat. "Are you portraying someone again?" Carol asked. Louisa laughed cheerfully and replied, "Now I'm playing the role of a future mommy. By the way, it's going to be twins. They told me at the ultrasound yesterday." Carol looked at her sister tenderly, leaned in, and whispered softly in her ear, "Just never be apart," understanding her unspoken words. Carol realized what a miracle it was to have a sister. It was a special, inexplicable bond, a combination of friendship, reliability, and support. It could only be described with one all-encompassing and most valuable word: family. No matter what happens in life, sisters and brothers must stick together.